Hi there, Frontline Church family and friends. Today we are in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1 through to 15. And I think it's important just to remind ourselves of the context of this letter, who the letter was written to. Hebrews was written to Jewish believers in Jesus, and those believers were under pressure from their community to return back to the legalism and the laws and the striving of Judaism. They were being tempted to fall away from grace, God's grace that gifts us with salvation, God's grace that empowers us to live in holiness, to exchange that grace for self-effort and striving and religiosity. So this letter to these Jewish Christians is structured around demonstrating how Jesus is superior to and greater than all those different elements of the First Testament, the Old Covenant. Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than the message of God in the Torah, the writings of Moses. That's what we've seen in chapter 1 and 2. And today we're seeing how Jesus is greater than Moses. That was a big, shocking thing for Jews to hear in the day. So how is Jesus greater than Moses? Well, here Jesus is portrayed like a second Moses, or perhaps retrospectively, more accurately, we're caught to see Moses as like a predecessor, shadow, type, an imperfect prophetic glimpse of who Jesus, the one to come, who he would be. So Jesus and Moses, they both led God's people. But Jesus is worthy of greater honour than Moses because Moses was a servant in God's house. The word oikos here, God's oikos. But Jesus is a son over God's household. So Jesus is greater. Jesus and Moses both led God's people out of slavery. Moses led the people out of Egypt, but Jesus is worthy of greater honour because Jesus has led his people out of sin and death. So Jesus is greater. Jesus and Moses both led God's people into a promised land. Moses led the people to Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, a land of rest. That's what the word rest means here. But Moses and his generation, they didn't themselves enter that rest. They didn't enter that land because of their unbelief and the hardness of their hearts. We see in today's passage. But Jesus is greater than Moses because Jesus has led us into a greater rest, a perfect rest, into his kingdom where we now live in rest, in grace. We are sustained in that holiness by Jesus. Moses and Jesus both built a place for God's presence and glory to dwell. Moses built a tabernacle, a house, a temporary tent with a holy place where God's presence rested on earth, separated by that curtain, restricted entry. But Jesus is greater because the house that he built, well, we are that house. You and I are that house. God's people are built as living stones into a living temple where God's glory and presence dwells forever without restriction. So yes, Moses was great and worthy of honour, but Jesus is so much greater. And these ideas are going to be developed over the coming readings, but this passage, it does come with a warning, doesn't it? Did you spot the warning? In the same way that God's people, led by Moses, complained and moaned and doubted God's promise and provision in the desert, in the same way that they turned to idols, and the result of that was that they wandered around aimlessly for 40 years, round and round in circles in the desert, never entering a state of rest. In the same way, we can be God's people and still have hard hearts. We can still wander around in circles, the same old, never really entering into the fullness of God's grace. Verse 13, in response to this, it says, therefore let us encourage one another daily. And I love that. I mean, here we are each day doing our Moravian texts. I pray that in doing so, we would encourage one another to hold on to grace, to hold on to that rest, to rest in that grace, to know our true identity, to not be led astray into legalism and striving and law, to keep our hearts soft, to really be God's holy people in this world, for that is who we truly are. Amen.